Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's free online event by the JFK Peace Speech Committee. It's August 10th, 2024, and we're very pleased to have as our guest speaker today, Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway. As always with these online events, which last for an hour and a half, our first half hour will be a screening of JFK's June 10th, 1963 commencement address at American University, which has become known as his peace speech and which is chillingly relevant today. Then we will hear from Professor Diesen for the next half hour, and then the final half hour will be Q&A. So let me get started now and introduce Professor Glenn Diesen. As I mentioned, Glenn is professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia in Global Affairs. Professor Diesen has published 11 books on Russian foreign policy, geo-economics, and Eurasian integration. His books include The Ukraine War and Eurasian World Order, which was just published this year, and The Think Tank Racket, Managing the Information War the Think Tank Racket, Managing the Information War with Russia, which was published last year. Also want to say that Wikipedia notes that Professor Diesen is opposed to Russia's military action against Ukraine, and I look forward to talking with him about that during the Q&A. And now let me introduce Professor Glenn. Oh, I'm sorry. Now let's start the video of the speech, after which we will hear from Professor Glenn Diesen.
And public support. There are few earthly things more beautiful than a university, wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He did not refer to towers or to campuses. He admired the splendid beauty of a university because it was, he said, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter-weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication. One step in this direction is the proposed arrangement for a direct line between Moscow and Washington to avoid on each side the dangerous delays, misunderstandings, and misreadings of others' actions which might occur at a time of crisis. We have also been talking in Geneva about our first step measures of arms controls, designed to limit the intensity of the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace, which would take the place of arms. The pursuit of disarmament has been an effort of this government since the 1920s. It has been urgently sought by the past 3 administrations. And however dim the prospects are today, we intend to continue this effort, to continue it in order that all countries, including our own, can better grasp what the problems and the possibilities of disarmament are. The only major area of these negotiations where the end is in sight, yet where a fresh start is badly needed, is in a treaty to outlaw nuclear tests. The conclusion of such a treaty, so near and yet so far, would check the spiraling arms race in one of its most dangerous areas. It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. It would increase our security. It would decrease the prospects of war. Surely this goal is sufficiently important to require our steady pursuit, yielding neither to the temptation to give up the whole effort, nor the temptation to give up our insistence on vital and responsible safeguards. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce 2 important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. Second, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad. We must show it in the dedication of our own lives, as many of you who are graduating today will have an opportunity to do by serving without pay in the Peace Corps abroad or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. But wherever we are, we must all, in our daily lives, live up to the age-old faith that peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities today, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. It is the responsibility of the executive branch at all levels of government, local, state, and national, to provide and protect that freedom for all of our citizens by all means within our authority. It is the responsibility of the legislative branch at all levels, wherever the authority is not now adequate, to make it adequate. And it is the responsibility of all citizens in all sections of this country to respect the rights of others and respect the law of the land. All this is not unrelated to world peace. When a man's way please the Lord, the scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interests of both. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Okay. I imagine many of you have heard that speech before, and maybe some of you haven't. And it's the mission of this group to get more Americans to hear it because it's so powerful and it's so relevant today. Now I'd like to once again just briefly introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Glenn Diesen. Glenn is a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia in Global Affairs. Professor Diesen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I couldn't agree more. I think this speech by JFK is incredibly important. And the fact that this kind of talk is so distant from what we're hearing these days makes it all the more important. And I would say that the message and speech of President Kennedy was really great importance because not only did the message of peace encourage the Americans and their European allies to humanize their adversary as a necessity to avoid war and pursue peaceful solutions. But very importantly, the message was also received in Moscow by Khrushchev, who then saw a friendly face and opportunity to overcome the military rivalry and pursue peace, proving, as he said, that war is not unavoidable. And I think that the peace he was pursuing very clearly was not naive. He recognized the security competition among the great powers, but the important recipe for how to deal with security competition is you want to have deterrence, but without provoking the other side. This is really the key recipe for any stable peace. And over time, you have the possibility or prospect to develop trust as well. So JFK pointed out that a message of peace should not be controversial or difficult to make. What indeed should be difficult to make is the message of war. However, today, peace has nonetheless become taboo across the West, especially in our current proxy war against the Russians. And we have effectively criminalized diplomacy and negotiations, which is the condition for peace. So I will give you an example from Europe, what is going on this side of the pond. As the European Union has always considered itself a peace project. And whenever there has been a conflict around the world, the European Union always advocates for the same solution, which is to revive diplomacy and negotiations, end the bloodshed as soon as possible, and start talking. One doesn't have to agree on everything, but at least one has to start talking. This has always been the recipe, but until war came to Europe. Now it's not anymore. In the current conflict we have with Russia, the EU now openly rejects diplomacy and negotiations, as has chosen war as the only path to peace. Again, Hungary, who now holds the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union, recently made a visit to Ukraine and Russia to explore this possibility for restarting diplomacy and even negotiating an end to the war. However, the EU condemned it. They said our objective should be to isolate Russia and not give it legitimacy by talking to them. So Hungary is now even being punished by the European Union for its diplomatic peace mission. And the EU consensus, which is now coerced, is to reject any diplomacy. That is, we don't talk to the opponent. And our media has equally become very complicit. Our newspapers covering it tend to leave out that the Hungarian prime minister went to both Russia and Ukraine, and instead they tend to focus on his trip to Russia only in order to smear him as a stooge of President Putin. So this is the narrative-driven media, and what they're pushing is always conflict. Now, the incoming foreign policy chief of the European Union, Kallas, she recently argued very explicitly against diplomacy because, in her words, Putin is a war criminal and we should not legitimize war criminals by speaking to them. So the solution, what is the solution to peace? Well, it's not talking to your adversaries. And for God's sake, don't try to understand them either. Diplomacy instead is to sit in a room with people you already agree with and condemn the opponent for being evil and do not grant them any legitimacy. So one can ask then, how do they envision peace with Russia? Well, the outgoing foreign policy chief of the European Union doesn't envision any peace. He argues that the Ukraine war had to be solved on the battlefield. This is the foreign policy chief, while the incoming foreign policy chief has called for defeating Russia, which entails breaking the country up into smaller pieces. Now, one can always ask, how would we react if the Russians spoke in similar terms of our nations? So the same actually applies to NATO as well, our Cold War relic. The NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, which is our previous prime minister, he argues frequently that weapons are the path to peace. This is close to a copyright infringement of the dystopian message from George Orwell's 1984, in which war is peace. And across Europe, we see the Russian media censored, as we cannot understand, should not be able to be vulnerable to their arguments, as everything is now propaganda and should be censored. And even within Europe, journalists and academics in Europe who try to understand and explain the Russian position, to put themselves in the shoes of the Russians, are accused of being disloyal, they're intimidated, and have every reason to fear for their job. So not only is war peace, but ignorance is strength. And in short, this is clearly not the peace that JFK was speaking of. Nonetheless, whenever the political media leads push war and denounce diplomacy, they do not express any shame as warmongers, but instead they express virtue and self-righteousness. And one can ask why. And well, my answer is ideological conviction. They see this as being principled, pursuing a democratic peace, one which should not be corrupted by making any compromises with the evil adversaries. Now, I argue that ideology can have a devastating impact on peace. So when we speak of ideology, it tends to be a system of ideas, beliefs, and values to organize society. And this in itself does not have to be a bad thing. Indeed, our guiding ideologies will have many positive components. Liberalism, democracy, human rights, ideals which we should cherish as well as protect. However, what we often see is that this translates into a wider ideology by linking it to an entity of power, in which perpetual peace depends on promoting liberal democracy under the condition of Western hegemony. And herein lies, I argue, the danger of ideology, as the makeup of society is also renowned for being often used as a tool for power and control, and to justify divisions and conflict between groups. It can be used to mobilize the public against a dehumanized adversary. In short, ideologies, once you explain not the world as competing interests, but good versus evil values, then we represent the good values, adversaries represent the evil opposite. So no longer is there any real room for compromise. And we see that whenever we aim to take out an adversary, reality is often simplified and dumbed down. It is always done then in the name of freedom, democracy, or human rights. We see this with the crippling sanctions on Venezuela, invasion of Iraq, occupation of Syria, the destruction of Libya, the threats of war against Iran, the current proxy war against Russia, and also the future war against China. Every time we see that liberal democratic values are often used to sideline international law. And this is the great contradiction of this, how liberalism as an ideology has been used. Because human rights and democratic mandates in the international system, it was intended to create a more peaceful system. Why? It would restrict or restrain the actions of governments by having to take into account human rights as well as respect the self-governance of other countries. But instead, we see it's now enabling coercion against other governments. So whenever we want to do some sanctions, coups, invasions, we always cite our values. And this is quite dangerous. And it's important to understand that for much of the world, when they hear us speak of democracy and human rights, they usually assume that we're already loading the bombs on our planes, as this has become now the association. And ideology is often based on, or at least they can manipulate some of the basic instincts in human nature. As human beings, we tend to organize the world into groups, as we're a social animal. And these groups are, us, which is the in-group, versus them, which is the out-group. And ideology tend to assign us these good values, while our adversaries are the exact opposite. And we can't comprehend then why our adversaries would be afraid of us. After all, we stand for freedom, while we refuse to recognize any legitimate security concerns of our adversaries, because they stand for being against freedom. Now, there's a fascinating quote by President Reagan in I think it was 1987. Anyways, it was a few years after the Able Archer NATO military exercise, which almost triggered a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And this was Reagan coming to the recognition, in which he wrote, 3 years had taught me something surprising about the Russians. Many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy were genuinely afraid of America and Americans. I'd always felt from our deeds it must be clear to anyone that Americans were moral people who, starting at the birth of our nation, had always used our power as a force for good in the world. This is end quote. Now, it is remarkable that if you have two main powers stuck in a Cold War where each side feared the other one will annihilate them, that one would be surprised that the opponent would see you even as a threat. But this is often what ideology does to all of us. Now, obviously, in a world of competing security interests, what creates peace? Well, it's through mutual understanding and compromise. Again, the traditional understanding of how peace is created. However, in a world of good versus bad values, how can we resolve any conflicts? And I think this is also why we always refer to our adversaries as the new Hitler, because one cannot compromise with Hitler. Compromise and understanding and peace is merely appeasement. This is the word we always use. Instead, we're always living in the late 1930s, early 40s, and peace is instead created by defeating the adversary. Because, as we always learn, in a world of good versus evil values, compromise is appeasement, and we must instead destroy our opponents. This is a very different understanding of peace, one which JFK also warned against. But it's also a very good description of the dangerous mentality which we suffer of today. And whenever we have conflicts, our opponents are always labeled as such. And this mentality has taken us to where we are today, where NATO now declares that war is the path to peace, while also not just not doing diplomacy, but even punishing those who attempt to understand or even talk to the other side. So peace is our victory, our leadership, our hegemony to advance our values. Now, in his speech we just listened to, JFK argued for a just peace for everyone, not just for one side. And he reassured that America was not pursuing a peace based on Pax Americana, that is a peace based on US dominance. And when the Cold War came to an end and was declared to be over in Malta in 1989, for a brief period we did speak in this language of JFK. There was talk of the Cold War having ended thanks to negotiations and compromise, which produced a common peace through common security, and we would together build a common Europe. This was the end of bloc politics, and we signed our pan-European security agreements as well. However, 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and everything changed very quickly. Only 1 month after the collapse of the Soviet Union, President Bush Sr. gave a speech at the State of the Union in January of 1992, very different from the Kennedy speech, in which he argued, and this quote, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War," and then citing wars from Korea to Vietnam as have been part of producing this peace. So suddenly the negotiations were not mentioned. The compromise and common peace was also gone. He also added that we are the United States of America. The leader of the West has become the leader of the world. And as long as I'm president, I will continue to lead in support of freedom everywhere. End quote. And this was, I would argue, the beginning of the narrative of Pax Americana. The former US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, who also contributed to negotiating an end to the Cold War, he warned that this created myth-making from the first day the Soviet Union collapsed. And he argued this was very dangerous, this new war narrative, because peace was no longer seen to have been the result of diplomacy and negotiations with the Russians, but instead peace was the result of having defeated the Russians. So what he considered to be, again, a very false and dangerous lesson of history, which meant that effectively the peace which JFK had advocated was dismissed and instead replaced with this Pax Americana, where any emergence of any rivals would demand their defeat in order for peace to be restored. And I would say that the result for Europe has also been devastating, because the commitment we made to creating what Gorbachev referred to as common European home, or inclusive pan-European security architecture with the Russians, were also abandoned, even though we signed these agreements in the early 90s. But instead of removing the dividing lines on our continent, which we committed to, they were instead gradually moved toward the Russian borders over the next 30 years by expanding NATO. Now, when the Russians complained about betraying the pledge of a common peace and a common Europe based on indivisible security, we instead accused them of attempting to undermine the democratic peace under NATO and American leadership. Now, this very predictably, I argue, revived the Cold War logic, simply because all security was now back to zero sum. As NATO expanded, we had to agree or find out where the new dividing lines would be, and new conflicts would be quite predictable in societies which were already quite divided. Now, for those who remember the debates in the 1990s, there were a lot of both American and European leaders, political, military, intelligence, who warned that this would be a terrible decision. Even Bill Clinton himself warned in '94 that if we expand NATO, we could redivide the continent and recreate confrontation. Secretary of Defense William Perry even considered to resign his position, and also confirmed everyone recognized this would recreate conflicts with the Russians, but it was okay because the Russians were weak, so they neglected it. At this point, one who I would consider to be possibly the greatest American diplomat, George Kennan, was also an architect for the containment policies against the Soviet Union. He correctly predicted that this would start a new Cold War, exactly because it recreated the dynamic of the Cold War. He also argued that a hostile Russian reaction would be unavoidable, and then he also made the prediction that once that Russian reaction would come, we would attribute it to Russia's aggressive imperialist nature as opposed to a reaction to our decision to betray the common European security architecture and instead expand NATO. Indeed, when Bush Jr. Pushed through the idea in 2008 to grant future membership to Ukraine, the Europeans were very hesitant and pushed back, but eventually folded. As Angela Merkel of Germany argued, this would be seen by the Russians as a declaration of war. And even up to 2020, the former British ambassador to Russia, he warned that pushing Ukraine into NATO, that this was the best way to start a war if this is really what we wanted. So we knew kind of what we were walking into. This was predicted. This is very, very predictable, even though it has gone down the memory hole. And but it begs the question, why was this done? And again, I would attribute much of it to ideology. The assumption was ideology, NATO expansion would create this democratic peace. We would have facilitate a Pax Americana, as JFK warned against, that is hegemony and advancement of liberal democratic values. Now, we can obviously put ourselves in the shoes of the Russians and ask ourselves, what if we would have been in the same situation? What if the Russians or the Chinese attempted to increase their own security by, for example, pulling in Mexico into a military alliance, then sending weapon systems, modernizing its ports, and preparing for war with the United States? We can ask, how would the United States react? But we don't discuss this. Instead, we artificially frame military expansion solely into the language of advancing liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Sorry. Now, I often make the argument in terms of the Ukraine war that NATO expansion caused this war. But while it's possible to challenge ideas with facts, it's often nearly impossible with ideologies, as this is how we have built up the ideas of our societies. Now, for more than a decade, I have argued that if we wanted to strengthen Ukraine's security and sovereignty, then we should assist Ukraine in diversifying its economic ties so it doesn't become too dependent on Russia. We should also overcome the Cold War legacy of exclusive military blocs by instead allowing it to be a bridge instead of a bastion. Now, the last thing I have always argued we should do was to threaten NATO expansion, as this could make Ukraine into a frontline state, as this would then make Russia feel compelled to intervene militarily, and this would likely result in the mass deaths of Ukrainians, the loss of territory, and possibly the destruction of their nation. And this, again, for me, was very, very predictable. And it's not even my main ideas. In 2008, this was written by the current US CIA director, William Burns, who wrote that any attempts to expand NATO into Ukraine would likely cause a civil war in Ukraine. And the Russian would also then militarily intervene. And he even added that the Russians would not want to do this, but they would feel compelled because they could not accept NATO in Ukraine, much like US would not be able to accept Russian military in Mexico. So for me, this argument is very easy to defend. I can cite numerous American and European leaders who predicted that NATO expansion would trigger a war, which we won't say it anymore, of course, as we need the conformity. But if we cite them, we're told that this could legitimize the Russian invasion. So one cannot discuss this anymore. And I'm also told that our commitment to liberal democracy implies we can't give really Russia a veto of Ukrainian membership. But over the past 20 years, or over the 20 years that NATO attempted to pull Ukraine into NATO, every single poll between 1992 and 2014 proved that only 20% of Ukrainians even wanted to join NATO during all those years which they were being pulled into NATO. Now, I'm also told that Russia is authoritarian, the West is democratic, so any push of Ukraine into the Western orbit is democratic, irrespective of what the Ukrainians would want. But we also see what happened after 2014. That is, Washington asserted extreme control over the Ukrainian state. We learned that from day one after the government was toppled. The CIA began to cooperate to build bases or secret bases along the Russian borders. The Ukrainian general prosecutor even argued that Washington was running Ukraine like a colony since 2014, and people from NATO countries even took key position in the new Ukrainian government. The political opposition and media was purged with Western support. Russian culture, language, the Orthodox Church, all were given a minimal role because they were seen as linking Ukrainians to Russia. But this is also then portrayed as democratic, as the Ukrainians were allegedly liberated from centuries of Russian influence. So it's a very different way of looking at how we are pushing for the self-termination of Ukraine. Anyways, JFK made this point that peace is possible and war is not unavoidable. But this also demands that we take an opportunity to actually take yes for an answer and accept peace. But what we've seen over the past 30 years is we rejected every attempt of creating a durable peace with the Russians. First of all, for the first 25 years after the Cold War, between 1991 and 2014, Russia's main strategic objective was to integrate into inclusive European security architecture. That means no bloc politics. But instead, we said no, we would create a Europe without them, which became a Europe against them. In 2013, both Russia and Ukraine proposed a trilateral agreement with the EU in order to prevent Ukraine from being a front line and instead being a bridge. The Europeans said no, you have to choose us or the Russians. The Ukrainians made the right choice, and we then began to destabilize and topple their government. Before we toppled the government, the Ukrainian government attempted to resolve the crisis by forming a unity government with the opposition. The Europeans accepted, they signed it as guarantors, but then within the next 24 hours, we nonetheless toppled their government, and key top diplomats went to Kiev to give legitimacy to the coup instead of holding up our end of the deal. So we toppled the democratically elected government in Ukraine against the will of the majority of Ukrainians and also in violation of their constitution, and we called it a democratic revolution. When civil war predictably broke out, the Europeans negotiated, well, the French and the Germans negotiated the Minsk II peace agreement, but then spent the next 7 years undermining it. It was later admitted by both the Germans and the French that they were merely buying time to arm Ukraine, to create new realities on the ground. In 2019, Zelensky was then elected on a very powerful peace mandate with 73% of the vote. He ran on making peace with Donbass, Russia, by implementing the Minsk Accords, but he was then pressured to reverse his position as Western states backed nationalists who called it appeasement and capitulation. And in the name of democracy, we contributed to reversing the vote, which 73% of Ukrainians voted for. So again, we rejected the possibility of resolving the crisis. So problems built up, and in 2021, the Russians demanded security guarantees because as the Western countries began to entrench themselves more and more in Ukraine. Now, despite that Washington and NATO said that Russia would invade unless they got security guarantees, we nonetheless decided we couldn't give any guarantees to the Russians. The former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, even argued that success is confrontation, because no compromise can be made with the Russians. Peace happens when Russia can be weakened. This is actually his quote, success is confrontation. Now, when the Russians said enough was enough and invaded in February of 2022, on the first day of the invasion, they contacted Zelensky to start negotiations for peace, in demanding that they restore their neutrality. And on day 3, the Ukrainians and Russians had already agreed to start negotiations, and it was possible to get an end to the war and possibly have peace in Europe. This is when the United States and UK intervened by telling Ukraine that they could not support peace negotiations. However, if Ukraine would choose war, then NATO would supply all the weapons they would need. And this is when also the Ukrainians walked away. Now, even now, as we recognize that the war is lost, so we know that restoring Ukraine's neutrality is required in any future peace agreement. The NATO Secretary General nonetheless continues to say over and over again that Ukraine will join NATO immediately once the war is over, effectively making sure that Russia will take essentially as much territory as it can to prevent it from ending up in hands of NATO. So my point is that we already rejected every possible path to peace. So my conclusion is not that Russia is innocent and it has not made any mistakes, but we must also recognize that we instigated this conflict by expanding the military bloc towards Russian borders. And this was a recipe for peace, a hegemonic peace. And since every negotiation has been rejected or sabotaged as it was built on a different format of peace, a peace in which we had to also recognize the security concern of our opponents. Now, I'm not arguing we're evil, but I would say that ideology enables us to sell NATO expansion as a project for peace, or for perpetual peace, as we like to say. But in reality, it revived the Cold War with Russia, and it predictably triggered a war in Ukraine, which has put us on a path to nuclear war. And ideology often prevents us from course correction as well, and pursuing peaceful solution. Because we see that dissent is smeared as carrying water for Putin, one is labeled a traitor and frequently intimidated. Now, we all recognize that it's imperative for peace to put ourselves in the shoes of the other side. So I often ask people to do an exercise. Are you able to present or explain the position of Russia to the public in this conflict? Now, what we often see is if you don't even have to agree with it, but just present it. Now, if you're not able to because you don't know what they are, or you know what they are, but you fear the social costs that are imposed of you for daring to explain the Russian position, then it should be obvious to us why also peace has become taboo if we cannot even express the position of our adversaries. Now, armed with ideology, I would argue that the warmongers have hijacked the concept of peace, which is now the destruction of ideological adversaries and the restoration of hegemony. Now, I really hope that the message of JFK, as I said earlier, is spread so we can take back this concept of peace, as this relies on diplomacy, negotiations, mutual understanding, compromise, with the ultimate goal being indivisible security. So again, this is why I really hope that this video of a speech of JFK continues to circulate.
Thank you so much, Professor Diesen. Really appreciate your perspective and your suggestions. We now have 2 hands raised, so we'll begin our questions. I would like to unmute people to ask questions, but ask you to please keep it very brief so we have time for everyone. Thank you. And we have, I don't know, is that Diane or Ronald that has the hand?
Probably both.
Okay. Go ahead.
I lost you for a while there, but I got back. Yeah, I bring greetings from the Schiller Institute and the International Peace Coalition. I'm putting the documentation, well, I was going to put the documentation for my remarks until my computer turned black. And so anyway, if you want the documentation, go to schillerinstitute.com. And that's SCHILLER Institute.com. We wholly endorse the JFK policy for humanity's sake, but it also requires a new element. I mean, this is what I think I would add to that beautiful presentation we just heard. We need this new element beyond the humane negotiations and call for peace, which we have to offer, and that element is known as the new security and development architecture based on Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 principles, which is at that link. This policy of peace through development has been adopted by both China and Russia and is clearly represented by the BRICS plus organization and their bank. The Global South is on this track for physical economic growth, including increasing numbers of states. Our
Okay,
OASIS plan.
Diane, I'm going to interrupt you. I really appreciate that you put the link in the chat, and I just want to ask if you have a question for a question.
I do, but my request is for a comment from the speaker, from Professor Diesen, and I wanted to get out the idea so that he could respond to the idea. Is that okay?
Please finish up
Okay.
quickly.
I will, as fast as I can. I wrote it down, so it's limited. So the Peace for the Development, and most of the world is on track for this, the Global South and so forth. So on yesterday's International Peace Coalition Zoom meeting, Mrs. LaRouche's thorough keynote was followed by Lawrence Wilkerson, whose message was that empire has the capability to end civilization if the West does not adopt a JFK-type peace policy. So our International Peace Coalition was host yesterday to over 600 people representing over 50 countries. A united peace movement has the power to get that new policy by combining Jack Kennedy's concern for all parties' interests be observed with a universal approach to those interests. Economic physical development speaks to the gravest concerns of hungry, thirsty, homeless, unemployed populations around the world, needing clean water, food, healthcare, education, transportation, and in need of productive work, which could reactivate the West's dying and dead productive industrial base. And then I would ask Professor Diesen to comment, please.
Yeah, no, I agree that this is a possibility, a different path to peace, because a key problem, which many, at least in political realism, has recognized, is that the peacetime alliances obviously becomes very destabilizing. It perpetuates conflicts because it relies on the structure of peacetime alliances often means that the dominant state, in this instance the United States, often becomes reliant on conflicts, because then allies become more dependent while adversaries can be weakened, which is why, for example, it's often seen as favorable if there's some conflicts between India and China, because then the Indians have to subordinate themselves a bit to the NATO states, while the Chinese will gain a powerful adversary against the Chinese. So peacetime alliance has always been recognized to be very problematic. Now, what argues there's a possibility for a different peace at the moment, because the peace which was based after the Cold War, it has come to an end. I don't want to demonize too much this idea of Pax Americana, which was attempted, because the main idea, if there was an American hegemon, this would reduce the power competition in the rest of the international system, much like the US leadership in Europe helped to reduce power competition among European states. And also I think it was a genuine attempt to elevate the role of democracy and human rights in the international system. But the problem is, over time, as many predicted in the 90s, the hegemon would begin to weaken. A lot of the resources would go from the core to the periphery. You would see then economic decline, economic disparity. You would have then political and social instability, political polarization. Again, a lot of what we see today. And while the US would get weaker within, you would see new rival powers emerging, because a hegemon can only maintain itself if rival powers are kept down. So you would then see all these powers starting to connect economically in order to balance the United States. And this is, we'll look at BRICS with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now plus 5 more states. This is a key objective, which is to diversify economic connectivity to reduce the power of the United States. Now, at the face of it, this might seem like a challenge to the US, but I wouldn't say that it's anti-American. I would say that it's anti-hegemonic, and many of these countries, if not all, would have welcomed the US as one of the poles of power in the international system, but they reject it to be the dominant. And I think that it's also time to recognize that this is not a durable economic model either. And indeed, what we're now seeing is once the world now becomes multipolar, it also has many benefits. We see, as I mentioned, there's more economic connectivity, which then produces peace. So instead of this peacetime alliances, which is dependent often on perpetuating conflicts, we see now economic incentives for promoting peace, which is why if you look at a lot of the main developments, economic connections taking place also in the physical economy, but also financial, we see that it's promoted, well, for example, by BRICS. And then there's an interest in reducing conflicts. So just as a case study, look at the new member states of BRICS. They didn't build it on an alliance system. They brought in not either the Iranians or the Arabs as rivals. They brought in Iran as well as Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. They brought in both Egypt and Ethiopia. So they brought in the conflicting sides, also already having India and China, obviously. And then there's economic incentives for peace. So connecting their industries, the technology center, building physical corridors, new development banks, new payment systems, trading in own currencies. So across the board, we see now that with this economic connectivity, there's a real chance for promoting real peace. So I think this definitely is something that the United States should be a part of instead of opposing, as the hegemonic model has already come to an end. And as JFK would argue, this Pax Americana model should not have been the model pursued to begin with. Sorry for the long answer, by the way.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next question is from Donald Smith.
Yes, hi, Professor. Can you please comment on why in Europe are the European governments sacrificing their economies and their social spending to give money to the U.S. hegemony and increase their military spending? I don't understand why the politicians and the people put up with it. And the second part is, how can you and Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies and Jeffrey Sachs and others, David Swanson and others, get out the same message that the U.S. provoked this war in Ukraine, but it's very hard to get covered in the mainstream media. So comment on both expanding our people out of our, more people understand the message, and why European countries are bending over for Uncle Sam.
Yeah, no, this is a good question. I think this is also why there's a lot, not just economic upheaval, but also political upheaval across Europe now. All the major countries, be it Britain, France, Germany, the political elites have lost much of support in the polling. There's a lot of political instability. And I think part of the reason is indeed that they're no longer pursuing national interests and security interests. And this is causing much concern in the population. Now, why they're bending over backwards for the United States, I guess, many people would look to issues, for example, international institutions, that a lot of failed politicians on the national level, they have more opportunities in international institutions. So, for example, our previous Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, he kind of proved himself to the Americans by in the Libyan war, as Norway dropped, I think, about 10% of the bombs on Libya. So he was made the new Secretary General of NATO. Now he's going out, and it's worth seeing then how the new Rutte, who is the former Dutch Prime Minister, also because of corruption problems, was booted. But then in the end of his term, he made sure that he took a very hard stance against the Palestinians, hard stance against the Russians, and of course joined in on bombing of Yemen in order to win over the affection of Washington. So now he will be the new NATO Secretary General. So you can look at some of the differences between the national and international level. But I think overall, I often lean, again, what I talked about, which is ideology, because after World War II, throughout European history, we always had, well, a lot of conflicts is no secret on this continent. But after World War II, there was a sense of stability under US leadership. And then at the end of the Cold War, we very much embraced this ideology of the end of history or perpetual peace. But of course, we had hoped that there would be a collective hegemony. That is, Western hegemon would be based on two pillars, which was the US and the EU. And this would be how the world would be organized. Now, my argument is I think we lack the political imagination now that the era of unipolarity has come to an end. How will we organize Europe and world politics? I don't think we have any more political imagination. Our first instinct is to seek refuge again under US leadership, as we've done since the Second World War. And I don't think we're prepared for the new system, because when you have emergence of a multipolar system, the first thing you have to do is diversify your economic connectivity, have many partners. Because once you become too dependent on a partner which is more powerful than you, there's very asymmetrical interdependence. So you will see then the Europeans develop more and more dependence on the US and become less and less economic competitive. And we're now cut ourselves off the Russians. We're being asked to cut ourselves off Chinese technologies. So our economies are becoming very inefficient, and all our dreams of political autonomy, and we spoke of strategic autonomy and European independence for a long time. This is out the window. So this will be quite devastating, and I think was also quite obvious from the beginning of these sanctions that the Europeans would carry the brunt, because a lot of our industries were dependent on import of reliable and cheap Russian energy, and then being able to export to their market. And what I guess also the lack of political imagination is also the new world we're facing, because for the past 300 years, whenever the Russians wanted to modernize, they always had to Europeanize, look west to modernize. And we could always try to push them back into Asia, where they would remain backwards and not a concern to us. This is what we openly said was the French and the British when they fought the Russians in the Crimean War in the 1850s. And this is kind of the goal now as well. The problem now is that many of the largest and more dynamic economies are now in Asia. So since 2014, the Russians began to reorient their economy more towards the east in what they call Greater Eurasia. And as a result, we see that the Russians are able to diversify away from the Europeans, but the Europeans aren't really able to diversify away from Russia, which is why our energy, our technologies, our industries are suffering greatly. So I wish there would be more discussion, but again, if you open any European newspaper, all we read is everything is simplified and dumbed down to our liberal democracy and their authoritarianism, and why we can't make any peace with them. So I think peace with Russia is not to do the Russians any favors. I think it would do ourselves a great favor, not just in terms of security, but also political independence and economic prosperity.
Okay, our next question is from Miles Flegg.
Okay, Danatada, Tansi, hello and greetings, Treaty 7, Territory Canada. Why I use these Indigenous languages is because we're working on truth and reconciliation with Indigenous nations here. And the commissioner of that truth and reconciliation effort, one of the key aspects of getting to truth and reconciliation is education, which I thank you for, Glenn Diesen. You've been helping me many times for the past couple of years. And regarding ideology, there's a document that I have in my hand. It's a PDF of President Eisenhower's farewell speech of January 1961. And there's about pages 14 to 20 are dedicated to his warning of the conjunction of an immense military-industrial establishment and a large arms industry is a new American experience. And that was back in 1961. And he goes on, we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. And the councils of government must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex, and so on for several pages, right through to page 20. So very much describes the ideology that you are also referring to. This is the ideology of militarism. And I don't approve, like you don't approve, of a nation invading another nation. So we don't approve of Russia invading Ukraine. However, I also don't approve, and I'm sure you don't approve, of other violations of international law, like provocations and illegal sanctions and all sorts of other nefarious covert actions and activities. Now, unfortunately, the United Nations seems to be impotent. Russia, probably, I would recall, had made pleas to the United Nations for intervention, just like Iran has recently done to get some United Nations support against Israel's attacking it recently. Do you see any hope that the nations of the world will actually become united to improve the United Nations? Is BRICS a possibility towards that end? Because there's no international authority for international law these days. Thank you. I look forward to your comments.
Well, thanks, Miles, and also thanks for the kind remarks. I thought it was interesting, yeah, what you said about Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, or cautions of it during his farewell speech. Indeed, what's quite interesting, he initially called it in the columns of his speech, he referred to it as a military-industrial congressional complex, but he thought it would be too provocative, so he got the Congress out of this. But this is obviously a key area, how the military-industrial complex expresses its political influence. Again, this how many political leaders now have some board members of Raytheon or some other military giants. But this is not only the problem. I also think, for example, think tanks is a key way of the military-industrial complex to exercise political influence. Keep in mind that a lot of politicians out of power or out of government, they tend to be some kind of get some position in a think tank. Indeed, it seems most people now are a member of some kind of think tank who people are in government, and it's a good way of them staying relevant, and then the think tanks having someone on the inside. Now, the think tanks, the problem is obviously that they're funded almost completely by the arms industry, and the think tanks also then are able to outcompete journalists in terms of getting stories out. Now, what we see when you look at the journal articles, or no, sorry, the media articles written by the think tanks, much more likely they are to propose military solutions to any political problems in the world. And this is, again, this is what's often been criticized as the business model of the think tanks. They're essentially peddling influence, foreign policy for sale. And this also reminds me what George Kennan said towards the end of the Cold War, and he cautioned that, you know, if the Soviet Union would sink into the sea tomorrow, too much of society throughout the Cold War had been built up around the need for an adversary. Too much of the military, too many of the industries. So his prediction was that if the Soviet Union would sink in the sea tomorrow, we would need to find a new enemy very quickly in order to preserve the structures which had been built up throughout the Cold War, which seems like a good extension of what Eisenhower said. Now, in terms of the authority of the UN, yeah, I think that the United Nations, it represents international law, which is based on a balance of power, which existed to some extent after the Second World War. Now, when you have a balance of power, you have then all sides having an interest in mutual restraint and preserving the status quo. Now, the problem is, after the Cold War, when there's unipolarity, the balance of power is gone. Why would we accept any international law based on mutual constraint? States do not really constrain themselves. So one would then expect that the new rules and norms introduced into the international system would be based on sovereign inequality, sovereignty for me, but not for you. And I think this is why we have this, global war on terror, humanitarian intervention, promoting democracy. All of these are ideas which allows us to, interfere into the sovereignty of other states, but it doesn't go the other way, obviously. So no one would will turn their head if we interfere in the elections of other countries, because we do it because of our altruistic reasons, while others would obviously not be allowed to interfere in our elections. So this is part of the problem. And I think this is often what we also refer to as the rules-based international order, where you have human rights law effectively giving an exception, clause of exception for the NATO countries. So I think that this has been very bad for international law, simply because law, often by definition, has to be more or less consistent. But what I see is that we created two sets of parallel rules. So, for example, secession and territorial integrity. What are the rules? Well, international law, in accordance to the UN Charter, is very specific. Territorial integrity is really elevated. So if any group wants to secede, that comes second. But what we saw, for example, in Kosovo, we talk about, under human rights, we said, well, self-determination has to be put above territorial integrity. Okay, but in Crimea, we said, no, then it goes the other way. So we have all these competing principles, and the hegemon gets to select which one to follow. Now, this is why you see the Chinese, Russians, and many others very openly express very fierce opposition to what they refer to also as the rules-based international order. They demand a return to the UN Charter. So I think, here, just to summarize, I think international law in accordance with the UN predictably weakened under the unipolar order, and it could be restored by embracing some balance of power.
Okay, thank you. We now have, oh, I think I did that. Sorry about that. Okay, Todd Pierce has a question. We only have about 6 minutes left, and we have 3 people with their hand raised. Let's see if we can get to them.
So I'll try to make this quick. First, my qualifications for this question is the U.S. Army trained me as a psychological operations expert, been very much involved in U.S. Army Air Force low-intensity conflict doctrine, and a Guantanamo defense attorney as a human rights lawyer, still involved with an appellate case here in the United States, currently before the Supreme Court, hoping they'll hear it. So I really appreciate your talk. I think this has been the best one we've heard yet. And you're one of the few people that, as Marty might agree, that I wouldn't criticize. I think this was a great talk because you are talking about political ideology. And that is an overlooked subject. My own coming out of Guantanamo, trying to figure out how was it that we adopted a fascist legal system, because that's what Guantanamo is. Military commissions are martial law courts. And that's exactly what the fascist countries always utilize. And so, like I say, I went and studied political theory at the New School in New York, mainly, going toward Hannah Arendt and what she did as a political theorist. So, but not as criticism, but just as a question. You mentioned 2 things I want to bring up, the liberal international order, and then also Orban. And on the liberal international order, I think that term has been adopted so readily. And, even our president, you mentioned Reagan, and, to criticize Kennedy a little bit, these guys use those terms too, even while we were on the march, so to speak. I mean, we were preparing for Vietnam and had been in Vietnam, going to Eisenhower. Eisenhower had some severe conservative critics, the founders of the conservative movement, mainly Bill Buckley, Wilmore Kendall, and James Burnham, who were the most militaristic Americans probably in our history, denouncing him for his weakness. And that's what we're getting today from the American right wing. Even while they say, well, we're against sending aid to Ukraine, what they say, if you listen to the subtext, is no, we want Europe to pay for that because we want to go to war against China and Iran and support Israel in their fascist genocide. So I think it's important to understand ideology and understand it on a deeper level, which you introduced us to. So 2 more points. Cheney came up with the Cheney Doctrine in 1992, which declared to the world that they are now subject to our U.S. military control. It had to be revised a little bit, but as one of its authors said, we didn't change the meaning at all. I saw that as an Army officer come past my desk stating it in plain English, that our doctrine was that we would not allow any other country to even cause us to hesitate in our decision-making. That describes China, Iran, Russia exactly. So they're the natural enemy of the United States under that doctrine. And that's been ratified continuously by some Democrats and by all Republicans ever since. So I think we also need to change our language a little bit too, going to the issue of neuro-linguistic programming to include that this doctrine we're talking about, this ideology goes back to the conservative movement's founding and has continued throughout ever since. The biggest opponents Kennedy had was the conservatives like Barry Goldwater, William Buckley. So I think we need to expand our discussion a little bit. And one last point, we're seeing this exactly being played out today by the Conservative Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. And as somebody said, oh, Trump said that he's not part of it. No, he's exactly part of it. That's been made by a whole lot of people. But Trump's Agenda 47 is merely a watered down version of it, but it calls for far more development of nuclear weapons, etc. Any comments on that?
Thank you.
Oh, well, yeah, I don't really disagree on on Trump. I think to suggest he's pursuing more peace. I'm not sure if that's always the case. I think what he's expressed is more desire to have a return on empire, which is why he's very cautious about allowing allies of the United States to free ride on security. So, and effectively keeps saying, they should pay more for the privilege of protection. So again, I think it's more return to make it sustainable, which on its own is a reasonable argument, given that the US is weakening from within. So it can either walk back empire or get high returns. So I think he's going for the latter. Now, but what's interesting with the 1992, it came out in February, the Wolfowitz doctrine. It was not just only adversaries preventing, ensuring that Russia doesn't really recover, or other rivals, be it China, becomes too powerful. He even listed allies, be it Germany and Japan, that they should also not become too economically powerful, as no country should be able to rival the United States. And again, this is what JFK talked about. This is Pax Americana. If you want one hegemon, one state to dominate, it also demands that other rising powers are kept down. And so I agree. But I think my only point is that at the heart of it, I think often there's a lot of this is based often on good intentions. And there's a concept of which John Hertz introduced in the 1951, which is called idealist internationalism. And he pointed out how internationalist ideas often become reduced to national cause. So he looked at the French Revolution, great ideas about democracy, brotherhood of nations, and then it was assumed that there would be a global revolution, more or less under French leadership. When it didn't happen, the French announced, we will come to the freedom of all other peoples. So in other words, sovereign inequality. We will liberate the peoples of the world. You had the same with the Bolsheviks, he argued, which was they would also effectively suspend all foreign policy. They wouldn't interfere anywhere in the world. Very briefly, until that world revolution didn't occur, and then they also announced that they would come and help the people of the world, the proletariat of the world, to get their freedom. So they also subordinated their internationalist cause to their own leadership. And I think this is often the same we have after the Cold War with NATO. We also say we're going to free and represent the democracy of other peoples. We're going to help save other peoples, their human rights. And I think this is powerful exactly because there's a lot of genuine sentiment behind it, but it's always subordinated to a national cause. And when it comes down to power or the ideal, as we see, for example, as you mentioned, Israel, the ideals we have, are we willing to look the other way? Because the power structures will always trump it, because without the hegemon, there's no one to represent the values anymore. So after a while, the values corrupt themselves. And I think this is the problem of what we call the liberal international order. It's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. So, towards the end, it's not holy, it's not really Roman, and it's not an empire. And I think this is it's not liberal anymore, it's not truly international, and it's not orderly. This is, yeah, that was my thoughts around what you said.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are a little bit over time. We're at 2:32. I'm wondering if we can take one more question from Herb Weiner, who's had his hand up for a long time. Would that be okay?
Oh, I have plenty of time, so.
Okay, then let's continue for a few minutes here. Herb, would you like to ask your question?
All right. I'm wondering about two solutions for international conflict. In the case of Ukraine, I would like to see Ukraine have ironclad guaranteed neutrality. They would not join NATO, but they would be free to do commerce and diplomacy between the West and Russia. And that would, I believe, take the pressure off Russia, but also guarantee stability within Ukraine. And also, perhaps we could go to status quo ante as of 2014. Now, regarding the territories that are occupied, they could be autonomous territories. That would depend on the negotiations. In respect to Israel, I would like to see a two-state solution. This would be guaranteed by the IDF, also the Middle Eastern powers, and also Western powers that could supervise this, as well as personnel from the United Nations. I think that these would be two solutions. And the third thing, I believe we really have to emphasize world government. As long as the balance of power exists, you're going to have these conflicts that are going on ad infinitum. And also, I would like to recommend for the audience the book I Choose Peace by Connie Zoliakis. He was a Labor MP and also member of the League of Nations Secretariat. And his writings are very important at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I I agree with many of your recommendations. I think, given that NATO expansion is what triggered this war, I think it's quite obvious that restoring neutrality has to be the solution. Now, obviously, it's problematic in Ukraine because after this huge war with so many people dying, it's going to be now, unlike in the beginning of the war, much more difficult to have restored this neutrality, because it can't only be official neutrality from NATO, but it also have to be avoiding de facto NATO membership by having all these Western troops and weapon system placed on the Russian borders. And indeed, on the first day after we toppled the government in Ukraine, when the CIA and MI6 began to move in and establish these 12 CIA bases along the Russian borders, all of this has to go. So I think also the main goal should be to, I'm also a big advocate of a sovereign, independent Ukraine, but we also have to be, it has to be based on the model of Mexico. And Mexico has the freedom to have any foreign policy it wants. It can have any economic and diplomatic ties it wants. The US doesn't put restriction, but we also have to be honest with ourselves that Mexico doesn't have the freedom to join a military or Russian military bloc, that this would not be accepted any more than the US would have accepted Russian nukes in Cuba. It's just not going to happen. So I think the problem is that often when we talk about peace in Ukraine, the reason why we dismiss diplomacy negotiation is it's always denounced as, well, we're not going to give away Ukrainian territory. That's unacceptable. But it's worth noting that in the beginning of 2022, the agreements between the Russians and Ukrainians to end the war before the intervention by the Brits and Americans had nothing to do with the territory. The Russians accepted to withdraw back where they had been. And the only thing they insisted was neutrality. But once that was taken off the table and we decided for war instead, of course, now it is a territorial dispute. So I think any solution now has become so much more complicated because restoring neutrality would be one thing, but now again it's become a territorial dispute. In terms of Israel, I also agree. I think the two-state solution is really what is required, but I'm not sure if it's even possible anymore, given all the settlements on Palestinian land. And this is also not really an anti-Israeli argument. It's I think Israel has made a huge mistake because it insisted on it's been pushing for one state, rejecting a Palestinian state, and this is a crisis because if the territories which now tend to be ruled by Israel, effectively Greater Israel, is now only 50% Jewish, about 7.5 million. Now, how do you create an ethno-state in Greater Israel? If you're not even majority, it becomes very difficult. You can't have liberal democracy. It becomes apartheid. You have to rule over certain who are denied basic rights. You can pursue ethnic cleansing, which is happening in Gaza, but overall, I don't think it's. I think this is eating away at the soul of Israel as well. This is, I think, for too many years they didn't have to make any compromises because they had the collective West behind them, and I think, now they're really stuck in a corner. So. I'm not sure if a two-state solution is possible anymore, but I don't really see any other solution unless they give up on the whole idea of an ethno-state. And I'm not very optimistic about that prospect either. But I don't have any good solutions to Israel, and unfortunately, this is part of the problem.
Yeah, I just want to say one quick comment in that regard. It's that when our members of Congress go to Israel, they don't meet with grassroots peace organizations that are working very hard for healing in Israel-Palestine. And I wish they would meet with those people. We have one more question from Ronald Bedig. Go ahead, Ronald.
Just real quick, I put a reference in the chat on this resolution 377 before the United Nations. There's a unified effort, Code Pink, World Beyond War, Pax Christi, Veterans for Peace. People should look at that. This would actually override the United Nations Security Council and allow the General Assembly to actually determine things, including interventions militarily there at the border. So I don't know if there's a comment on that, but I just want to call people's attention to it because it is this Memorial Weekend. We could really get a lot done. Thanks. And there's a note in the chat.
Yeah, well, I tend to see the world very through the lens of political realism. So often I'm very I'm often critical of such reforms to the extent it doesn't reflect the balance of power, and that's simply because institutions, they tend to be effective when they reflect an international distribution of power, which is why I'm very supportive of reforms to, for example, make India or Brazil permanent members of the UN Security Council. But the problem often is one of the reasons why the UN has lasted so long and been successful is exactly because it reflected a balance of power. Because what we see is when states have that the veto power reflects the power they also have in terms of hard power. In other words, there is less need to use this hard power if it's converted or reflected in soft power, in, for example, veto. Now, let's say a scenario where the United Nations would vote for military intervention in Israel. The United States would never approve of this, so they would then put their military in place, so this would then begin to unravel the United Nations right away, which is why I'm a bit critical of it. This is, by the way, also a source of the conflict we have in Europe, because for 30 years we said, the Russians, NATO should be the main security institution in Europe, and Russia should not have any say. It should not have a veto. In other words, Russia, the largest country in Europe, should not have any say in European affairs. Now, if they don't have that institutional voice, then they have to express their veto in terms of hard power, and that's how I effectively see the invasion. They said this is no way we're going to have US NATO troops in Ukraine. If we can't veto it in an institution, then we have to use our military instead. And this is my fear also, if we would the UN, if you overrule the veto power, this is my concern. Then if it doesn't reflect the international distribution of power, then the great powers would then begin to rely more on military force in the absence of this institutional voice. So that would be my main concern. But the sentiment behind it, I certainly agree with. I'm just wondering if that's how we want the world to be rather than how it actually is.
I noticed that we had one more question in the chat. If you don't mind, I'll read it quickly. It's from Kari Pedersen, and it's NATO has historically worked for peace. What is the face of NATO today?
Well, I think NATO has changed simply because during the Cold War, I think the alliance system, which is imperfect, that is peacetime alliances, was the only available option. Again, since 1975, with the Helsinki Accords, we tried to lay the foundations for an international, for an inclusive security architecture, which worked, by the way. This was motivated, Gorbachev's reforms, his ideas of a common European home, and all the agreements which followed. But my point is that during the Cold War, while it was imperfect, NATO, I would argue, was a status quo power. It attempted to deter, but then not provoke. And it was assisted by many things. For example, we had a belt of neutral states running through Europe. Now, what happened after the Cold War is very different. Now, if we remember back in the 1990s, the main argument that NATO had to get out of area or out of business. In other words, what is the purpose now that we're not trying to deter anyone? If we want to maintain NATO, it has to have a new purpose. This is when we began with military interventionism, expansion. All of this became the new purpose. So to preserve the institutions. I would again say a lack of political imagination to create something else. Now, for me, this is quite dramatic because NATO transitioned from a status quo power to revisionist. Now, revisionist simply suggests it's altering, going away from the status quo. This is not even my argument. This was the point of Henry Kissinger when we invaded Yugoslavia in 1999. By the way, that happened 2 weeks after NATO did its first expansion. And as Kissinger then said, all our reassurances to the Russians that, well, NATO's just a defensive alliance, well, that went out the window as well as we invaded Yugoslavia against the UN Charter, by the way. So elevating the UN, elevating NATO above international law. So I think by beginning to expand NATO and pursuing military interventions, NATO transitioned from a status quo power to revisionist. So I don't think necessarily the issue of NATO has to be reduced to all or nothing, but rather recognize that that perhaps it could be a source of stability if it reverted back to being a status quo power. I mean, we still refer to NATO as a defensive alliance, even when we bomb countries like Yugoslavia, Libya, but these are more slogans and than anything else. So I think, NATO can still have a purpose, but what the Russians proposed in 2000, because they always wanted first an inclusive security architecture. When that wasn't possible, when we insisted on NATO, they suggested, can we join NATO? No. In 2008, the Russians suggested, how about an overarching European security architecture where NATO is one of the components under this umbrella? We also rejected this. Then they proposed, how about the EU-Russian Union, which we can have a common economic area from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Also, this didn't go anywhere. So I think it can have a role if it returns to being status quo, and also if it finds a way of positioning itself within some kind of an inclusive format based on the Helsinki Accords. But beyond that, I think it's, as a revisionist power, it's become a military alliance which now largely justifies its existence by responding to conflicts, which is caused again by its own existence. So it's not sure. In America, I think you refer to it as a self-licking ice cream cone. I'm not sure about that expression, by the way, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. Okay, well, it's I should say 2:46 p.m. Eastern time, and thanks to everyone who has stayed on for all of this Q&A, and thanks again so much to Professor Glenn Diesen. We look forward to staying in touch with you and to following you and your writings and your career. And we hope you'll join us on September 10th we don't know exactly who our speaker is going to be, which is very unusual, actually. We don't have our speaker confirmed yet for September 10th, but I guarantee you we will have a speaker. And I did put in the chat some of our upcoming speakers for October and November. And I hope you'll join us and maybe join our Facebook page. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and yeah, thanks for the great, excellent questions. Thanks again.